Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. My name is Randall Rose. I'm a member of Rhode Island Rights, which supports this measure. And it's been noteworthy how many people we've had here to support this measure and how many people have been speaking. That's one of the largest numbers I've ever seen for a good government measure in either chamber, actually. It shows how much people care about this issue. Rhode Island does have a bad reputation on gerrymandering. This is a measure that can fix it, and it doesn't actually take a lot of resources. I know there were concerns about the resources it would take. But actually, at one point in this amendment, it says that the amount of money appropriated for the independent commission should be at least as much as the was set up for the redistricting staff and effort of the prior census in 2002. So we're not expected to spend more. It's just going to be about the same amount. So it's not something that is expected to consume more resources. The commission can do its work with as much resources as was done for the 2012 redistricting. This amendment requires the same amount of money as for the 2012 redistricting. So it says you can't decrease it, but there's also no expectation that it would be increased either. So I don't think it's going to cause any more expenses. Of course, the measure does go into detail to make sure that that the redistricting process is fair. We know that in redistricting there are lots of incentives for self-dealing and other problems, and you do have to, if you have a process that's so high stakes with that much incentive for self-dealing and for distorting the outcome, you do have to have strict rules to make sure that it's being done in a fair way. And this amendment takes that requirement seriously. It has some complication, but the complications are in there just to make sure that there are no loopholes. I would be skeptical of a bill that was really short and simple. Because in a process where people are going to try to find leverage and when parties are going to try to get what they want out of it, it's very important to make sure that the people who are doing this are people who are not closely tied to politics, who aren't politicians' relatives like the bill requires, who are required to deliberate impartially and in public with plenty of transparency and with very clear criteria. I'm glad the amendment goes through these things and gets specific about it, because you have to be specific about it to make sure it's not done in a corrupt way. So that's exactly the right approach. It is actually quite traditional, and for good reason, that when you want to have measures about good government involving elections, you do want to make sure that both parties are equally represented. That's what's done at the federal level with the Federal Election Commission. It's not because we want an outcome where both parties get the same amount of seats, but because we want to make sure that the process is not tilted towards one party or another. And so if you're having a body that deals with the process to make sure it's not tilted towards one party or another, you want to make sure that both parties are equally represented. And even better is what this amendment does by making sure there's an equal number of independents on the commission who aren't tilted towards one party or the other. So I think that's a very good idea. I think it's very good that you don't have any political official choosing the majority of people on the commission. The majority of people on the commission are chosen by randomly drawn commission members, and that's the right approach. But the main thing I want to say about this amendment is something that has not been said before. It's being looked at as an anti-gerrymandering amendment, and it does that. It does that very well, but it also does one other thing very well we haven't talked about yet, and that is to make sure that Rhode Island's communities are well represented in the Statehouse and the State Senate. I think it would be great if we had State House districts and State Senate districts that clearly did have representations for particular towns, instead of having so many towns split between one district and another, or between many different districts. Where possible, you would want to have each town in its own district and not have towns unnecessarily split. You would want to have neighborhoods where particular communities live to be in one district, district and not unnecessarily split. And this amendment puts a pretty high priority on that. Now, I know in this day and age we can't have a redistricting process that only goes by town boundaries or neighborhood boundaries, because first of all, it has to be one person, one vote. You have to follow the Federal Voting Rights Act. And also, if you did it that way and it ended up advantaging one party over another, people would be screaming about it and it wouldn't be possible. But to the extent it's possible to make sure that towns and neighborhoods are respected in the districting process, this amendment does as much as is possible, because it says that should be making sure that towns and neighborhood boundaries and communities of interest are respected in the redistricting process. This amendment says that should be the very highest priority next to one person, one vote, after one person, one vote, after the Voting Rights Act, after making sure it's not tilted towards one party or another. The very next highest priority is respecting the towns and communities that we should be caring about here. And that's about the highest priority that you can practically achieve for that goal. So I think it's very good that we're doing this. If this amendment is put on the ballot, no question, the people of Rhode Island will pass it, and just like they've passed every other independent commission that's been put before the voters, the people of Rhode Island will pass it, and they will want it because it allows their towns and neighborhoods to be fairly represented, which is something that we couldn't have any other way. If you don't have an independent commission process, there'll be too much incentives to distort the boundaries for all sorts of shady political reasons. So I think it's good to have a process that ensures that communities and neighborhoods and towns will be represented. This is the best way to do that, as well as being the best way to design an anti-gerrymandering initiative. And I hope you let the people of Rhode Island vote on it, because the people of Rhode Island really want this. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lombardi.
Mr. Rose, if you haven't realized, I'm pretty interested in this subject because I'm talking with every witness. But I'm curious, you are not shy to critique proposed legislation in the past. Do you find anything problematic with this legislation at all? For instance, I raised the issue of the Secretary of State having this ability to block out potential people based on some conflict of interest. Are you okay with that, or do you any critique in this legislation?
I didn't have any critique. I know you mentioned that. I know actually the ACLU mentioned the same possibility, the same issue, that it was possible to be more specific about what the criteria were for conflicts of interest. As you may have gathered, I don't have any objections to being more specific about that. And I know there was some talk about maybe redrafting it to be more specific. But because the bill is so specific on all the ways that I think are important, and because the bill actually says that conflict of interest doesn't have very much direct effect on the outcome, because it only affects the pool from which 6 candidates are randomly drawn, and those 6 candidates aren't even the majority. So I think there's enough insulation there that I'm not particularly concerned about that. It would be kind of a Rube Goldberg thing if you wanted to influence the process by manipulating the criteria for conflicts of interest, because that only affects the pool, and then there's a random drawing, and then those people choose 9 others. Sorry, I don't see it working. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Mr. Rose? Thank you.